The autumn rain fell steadily against the tall windows of the corporate headquarters, each droplet catching the fluorescent light like tiny diamonds before sliding into obscurity. Marcus Aurelius Chen stood motionless in his corner office, watching the city below through the glass that separated him from the chaos of the outside world. The irony of his name was not lost on him, named after the philosopher emperor, yet operating in a realm where philosophy met the brutal realities of modern corporate warfare. For 37 years, Marcus had been building something that others could not see, could not touch, and certainly could not destroy. It was not wealth, though he had accumulated substantial amounts. It was not power in the conventional sense, though his influence reached into boardrooms across 3 continents. What Marcus had built was something far more valuable and, infinitely more dangerous, the weaponization of silence. The intercom buzzed softly, interrupting his contemplation. Mr. Chen, the board meeting is scheduled to begin in 10 minutes. The voice belonged to Sarah, his assistant of 12 years, one of the few people who understood that his silences were not empty spaces but carefully constructed fortresses. Thank you, Sarah. I'll be there shortly. His voice carried the weight of deliberate calm, each word measured and purposeful. In the corporate world where others rushed to fill every silence with noise, Marcus had learned the ancient art that Niccolò Machiavelli had written about 5 centuries earlier, that silence, properly wielded, could topple kingdoms and remake worlds. The board meeting that awaited him would determine the future of Chun Industries, the technology conglomerate he had built from a single patent filed in his garage 23 years earlier. But, more importantly, it would serve as the culmination of a strategy that had taken decades to perfect, the systematic destruction of his weak self through the disciplined application of strategic silence. Marcus moved away from the window and picked up a worn leather journal from his desk. The journal contained not business plans or financial projections, but rather a collection of observations, strategies, and philosophical reflections that had guided his transformation from an impulsive young engineer into one of the most formidable figures in international business. On the first page, written in his careful handwriting, were the words that had become his guiding principle: the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This principle had not come easily. 23 years earlier, Marcus Chen had been everything that his current self would find contemptible, reactive, emotional, prone to defending himself against every slight, and incapable of maintaining silence when silence would serve him better. He had been, in Machiavellian terms, utterly defenseless against the machinations of more seasoned players in the corporate arena. The transformation had begun during what he now referred to as the Blackwood incident, though at the time it had felt like nothing short of complete professional annihilation. Marcus closed his eyes and allowed himself to remember those dark months when everything he had worked for seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. James Blackwood had been the CEO of Titan Technologies, a rival firm that specialized in acquiring promising startups and either absorbing their innovations or destroying them to eliminate competition. When Blackwood set his sights on Chen Industries, Marcus had reacted exactly as his weak self dictated, with indignation, public protests, legal challenges, and a media campaign designed to expose what he saw as predatory business practices. Every move Marcus made in those days was predictable, emotional, and ultimately self-destructive. Blackwood, a student of corporate warfare who understood the power of allowing his opponents to destroy themselves through their own reactions, simply waited and watched as Marcus burned through his resources, alienated potential allies, and exposed every weakness in his business model through his desperate attempts at self-defense. The lesson had been brutal but invaluable. As Marcus sat in the ruins of his first company, watching Blackwood's legal team pick apart the pieces, he experienced what he would later recognize as a moment of profound awakening. He realized that he had been defeated not by superior strategy or better technology, but by his own inability to control his reactions, his need to fill every silence with justification, and his fundamental misunderstanding of where true power resided. It was during this period of reflection that Marcus encountered the works of Niccolò Machiavelli, not through academic study but through the recommendation of an elderly janitor named Eduardo who cleaned the office building where Marcus was working as a consultant, trying to rebuild his career. Eduardo, who had fled political persecution in South America decades earlier, recognized something in Marcus's situation that reminded him of the political upheavals he had witnessed in his youth. "Young man," Eduardo had said one evening as Marcus worked late into the night, "you fight like a man who believes that noise equals strength. But the most dangerous enemies are those who move in silence, who let others reveal themselves through speech while they gather intelligence through listening. Eduardo introduced Marcus to Machiavelli's concept of virtue, not virtue in the moral sense, but rather the ability to adapt one's methods to circumstances, to maintain composure under pressure, and to understand that effective power often operates through what is not said rather than what is proclaimed. More importantly, Eduardo shared insights about the relationship between self-mastery and external influence that would become the foundation of Marcus's philosophical transformation. The prince teaches us about ruling others, Eduardo explained, but the deeper lesson is about ruling oneself. A man who cannot master his own reactions, who cannot sit comfortably in silence while others reveal their intentions, who cannot resist the urge to defend himself against every provocation, such a man will always be at the mercy of those who possess greater self-control. This conversation initiated what Marcus would later describe as his reconstruction period, 2 years of intensive self-examination, strategic planning, and the systematic elimination of the reactive patterns that had led to his downfall. He began studying not just business strategy and technology, but also philosophy, psychology, and the historical examples of leaders who had achieved enduring influence through the mastery of themselves rather than the domination of others. The process was neither quick nor comfortable. Marcus discovered that his tendency toward reactive behavior was deeply ingrained, rooted in childhood experiences of feeling overlooked and undervalued. His need to justify himself, to explain his decisions, to defend against criticism, these impulses had served as psychological protection mechanisms, but they had also made him predictable and manipulable in professional contexts. The first discipline he imposed upon himself was the practice of strategic silence in meetings. Instead of immediately responding to questions or challenges, Marcus began implementing what he called the pause, a deliberate moment of silence before speaking that served multiple purposes. It prevented reactive responses, allowed him to observe the dynamics in the room, and created a subtle psychological pressure that often caused others to fill the silence with information he would not have obtained through direct questioning. The results were immediate and revelatory. In a business culture where quick responses were often valued over thoughtful ones, Marcus's measured approach began to mark him as someone who spoke with unusual authority. Colleagues and competitors alike began to interpret his silences as signs of deep thinking rather than hesitation, and his eventual responses carried greater weight because they followed periods of apparent contemplation. But the transformation went far deeper than communication tactics. Marcus began to understand that the weak self Eduardo and Machiavelli had referenced was not simply a collection of bad habits, but rather an entire way of being in the world that prioritized immediate emotional satisfaction over long-term strategic advantage. The weak self needed constant validation, reacted defensively to criticism, and sought to control outcomes through force rather than influence. The strong self, by contrast, was characterized by what Marcus came to call detached engagement, the ability to remain fully present and responsive to situations while maintaining emotional equilibrium and strategic perspective. This required not the suppression of emotions, but rather their transformation from reflexive reactions into conscious choices about how to respond. Marcus began keeping detailed records of his interactions, noting patterns in his own behavior and the responses they generated from others. He discovered that silence, properly applied, created a kind of psychological vacuum that others felt compelled to fill, often revealing far more than they intended. In negotiations, he found that the person who spoke first after a long pause was usually the person with less power in the dynamic, and that his willingness to remain comfortable with silence often shifted the psychological balance in his favor. More importantly, he began to recognize that silence was not merely the absence of speech, but rather a positive force that could shape situations in subtle but profound ways. When someone made an unreasonable demand, for instance, Marcus learned that a thoughtful silence often communicated more effectively than any verbal response. The silence forced the other person to confront the reasonableness of their position without the defensive dynamics that arguments would create. This approach required tremendous discipline, particularly in situations where his instincts urged him toward immediate response. When competitors spread rumors about his business practices, his weak self wanted to issue public denials and engage in point-by-point refutations. His developing strong self recognized that such responses would only amplify the rumors and validate them as worthy of attention. Instead, Marcus maintained silence and allowed his actions and results to speak for themselves, while privately gathering information about the sources and motivations behind the rumors. The strategy proved devastatingly effective. Within 6 months, the rumors lost their power through lack of reinforcement, and Marcus had identified several competitors who had revealed their own insecurities and tactical approaches through their attempts at manipulation. The information he gathered during this period became valuable intelligence that he could use in future dealings with these individuals. As his practice of strategic silence matured, Marcus began to understand that its power derived not from any mystical or manipulative properties, but rather from its rarity in a culture addicted to immediate response and constant communication. In a world where most people felt compelled to fill every pause with words, someone who could remain comfortable with silence possessed an enormous tactical advantage. The psychological mechanisms underlying this advantage became clearer as Marcus studied the behavior of others during his periods of silence. People interpreted silence differently based on their own psychological makeup. Insecure individuals often assumed that silence indicated disapproval or judgment, while confident people sometimes interpreted it as agreement or contemplation. In both cases, Marcus gained valuable information about the psychological state and motivations of the people he was dealing with, information that would have been much more difficult to obtain through direct questioning. But, perhaps the most significant insight from this period was Marcus's growing understanding of the relationship between self-mastery and external influence. The discipline required to maintain strategic silence in challenging situations was the same discipline that enabled him to resist other forms of reactive behavior. As he became more comfortable with silence, he also became less susceptible to manipulation through flattery, intimidation, or other emotional appeals. This internal transformation began to manifest in external results. Marcus's second company, built on the foundation of the hard-won wisdom from his failure with Blackwood, began to attract attention from investors and partners who were drawn to what they perceived as his unusual level of composure and strategic thinking. His reputation as someone who thought before speaking became an asset in an industry where impulsive decision-making often led to costly mistakes. The irony was not lost on him that his growing influence was based not on what he said, but on his increasing mastery of when not to speak. This paradox perfectly illustrated Machiavelli's insight about the relationship between perception and reality in the exercise of power. True authority, Marcus was learning, did not require constant demonstration or defense, but rather the quiet confidence that came from genuine capability and self-knowledge. As Marcus prepared to leave his office for the board meeting that would serve as the ultimate test of his transformation, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The naive young engineer who had been destroyed by James Blackwood 23 years earlier would not have recognized the man he had become. Where that earlier version of himself had been reactive, defensive, and driven by the need for external validation, Marcus had systematically cultivated the opposite qualities: strategic thinking, emotional equilibrium, and an inner confidence that required no external confirmation. The weak self that had made him vulnerable to Blackwood's manipulations was not merely dormant, it had been systematically dismantled and replaced with something far more formidable. The man who walked toward the boardroom was someone who understood that the most dangerous weapon in any conflict was not superior force or better information, but rather the ability to remain silent while others revealed their weaknesses, needs, and strategies. This understanding would be put to its ultimate test in the coming hours, as Marcus faced a challenge that would determine not only the future of his company, but the validity of everything he had learned about the relationship between silence, self-mastery, and power. The board meeting ahead represented the culmination of a strategy years in the making, one that would demonstrate whether the principles he had learned from Machiavelli and Eduardo could withstand the most intense pressure the corporate world could apply. But, as Marcus walked down the hallway toward the boardroom, his footsteps measured and unhurried, there was no anxiety in his bearing, no tension in his shoulders, no urgency in his movement. The man who had once felt compelled to fill every silence with justification now moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that true power lay not in speaking, but in knowing when speech would diminish rather than enhance his position. The transformation was complete, but the test was just beginning. In the boardroom ahead, Marcus would face not only external opponents but also the ultimate challenge to his reconstructed self: maintaining strategic silence and emotional equilibrium in a situation where everything he had built was at stake. The weak self that had been systematically destroyed over the past 2 decades would face its final temptation to reassert itself through defensive reaction and emotional response. But the strong self that Marcus had cultivated understood something that his opponents did not: that the man who has truly destroyed his weak self cannot be destroyed by others, precisely because he has eliminated the psychological vulnerabilities that external pressure typically exploits. As he reached for the boardroom door, Marcus carried with him not just years of strategic preparation, but the deeper knowledge that he had become someone who could not be shaken by the very forces that had once seemed so overwhelming. The silence that awaited him in that room was not empty space to be filled with defensive words, but rather a weapon more powerful than any argument, more effective than any presentation, and more dangerous than any threat his opponents might deploy. The coming confrontation would demonstrate whether 2 decades of disciplined self-transformation could withstand the ultimate test of strategic conflict, or silence would indeed prove to be the most dangerous weapon of all. The boardroom occupied the entire top floor of the Chen Industries building, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city that Marcus had helped reshape through 2 decades of methodical expansion. As he entered the room, the subtle shift in atmosphere was immediately apparent. Conversations that had been animated moments before became muted, and the 11 board members seated around the polished mahogany table turned their attention toward him with expressions that ranged from expectant to openly hostile. Marcus took his seat at the head of the table without hurry, placing his leather journal to his right and folding his hands in front of him. The silence that followed was not the comfortable quiet of a routine meeting, but rather the charged atmosphere that precedes a storm. In that silence, Marcus could feel the weight of months of preparation, years of strategic positioning, and decades of personal transformation converging into this single moment. Robert Hastings, the board chairman and Marcus's former mentor, cleared his throat, a sound that in less charged circumstances would have been unremarkable, but which now carried the weight of formal initiation into what everyone present understood would be a battle for the future of Chen Industries. Hastings was 73 years old, a veteran of corporate wars that had reshaped entire industries, and, until recently, Marcus had considered him not just a colleague but a friend. The events of the past 6 months had changed that dynamic irrevocably. Marcus, Hastings began, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had rehearsed his words carefully. We've called this special meeting to address concerns that have been raised by several board members regarding the direction of the company and certain decisions that have been made without full board consultation. The words hung in the air like an accusation dressed in parliamentary language. Marcus recognized the careful phrasing for what it was, the opening move in a carefully orchestrated attempt to remove him from his position as CEO and founder of the company he had built from nothing. The weak self that he had systematically dismantled over the past 20 years would have responded immediately with defensive explanations, detailed justifications, and emotional appeals to loyalty and shared history. Instead, Marcus maintained silence, allowing his gaze to move slowly around the table, making brief eye contact with each board member. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in the context of a corporate boardroom, and Marcus could observe the subtle ways that this pause affected the dynamics in the room. 3 board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, 2 reached for their water glasses, and 1, Victoria Sterling, whom Marcus had recruited personally 5 years earlier, looked away entirely, unable to maintain eye contact. These small reactions told Marcus everything he needed to know about the psychological state of his opposition and provided valuable intelligence about how the coming confrontation would unfold. The discomfort that his silence created was not accidental, it was a deliberate application of the principles he had learned from his study of strategic psychology and power dynamics. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough that the others had to lean forward slightly to hear him clearly. I understand that some of you have concerns. I'd like to hear them expressed directly rather than through procedural language. The words themselves were unremarkable, but the manner of their delivery, calm, measured, and utterly without defensiveness, immediately shifted the balance of power in the room. The request forced his opponents to abandon their carefully scripted approach and speak more plainly about their intentions. It was a classic application of the principle that the person who can remain comfortable with silence and direct communication holds the psychological advantage over those who rely on indirection and euphemism to advance their position. Margaret Fielding, the chief financial officer who had joined the board 3 years earlier as part of an expansion strategy that Marcus now realized had been a tactical error, was the first to respond to his invitation. Her voice carried a slight tremor that betrayed her nervousness despite her obvious preparation for this moment. Marcus, the concern is that you've been making major strategic decisions, particularly regarding the Yamamoto acquisition and the European expansion, without bringing them to the board for proper discussion and approval. These decisions involve hundreds of millions of dollars and, fundamentally alter the risk profile of the company. Again, Marcus allowed silence to follow her statement, but this time he used the pause differently. Instead of creating psychological pressure, he used the silence for genuine reflection, considering not just the surface content of her complaint but the strategic implications of why this particular issue had been chosen as the vehicle for the broader attack on his leadership. The Yamamoto acquisition had been a calculated risk that Marcus had pursued precisely because he understood that some board members would oppose it if given the opportunity for extended deliberation. The acquisition of the Japanese technology firm would position Chen Industries as the dominant player in quantum computing applications, but it required the kind of bold, rapid action that committees were structurally incapable of executing. Marcus had chosen to proceed with limited board consultation not out of disregard for proper governance, but because he understood that the window of opportunity would close if subjected to the months of analysis and debate that full board involvement would require. The decision had been vindicated by results. The acquisition had already generated returns that exceeded projections, but his opponents were using the procedural violation as justification for a broader challenge to his authority. Margaret, Marcus said finally, the Yamamoto acquisition has generated a 28% return on investment in the 6 months since completion, and our quantum computing division is now positioned to capture the majority share of a market projected to reach $40 billion within 3 years. Are you suggesting that seeking committee approval for that decision would have improved those outcomes? The question was delivered without hostility or defensiveness, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew that his results spoke more eloquently than any procedural argument could. More importantly, the question forced Margaret to defend a position that was difficult to sustain when faced with successful outcomes. Margaret's response revealed the deeper dynamics underlying the confrontation. The issue isn't the financial results, Marcus. The issue is that you've consistently acted as though this board exists merely to rubber stamp decisions you've already made. That's not governance, that's autocracy disguised as leadership. The accusation was serious and had been carefully crafted to appeal to board members who might be concerned about their own authority and influence. Marcus recognized that this was the central challenge he faced, not just defending specific decisions, but addressing the broader question of how power should be distributed within the organization he had created. Once again, Marcus chose silence as his initial response, but this time the pause served a different strategic purpose. He was allowing Margaret's accusation to hang in the air without immediate contradiction, creating space for other board members to respond and thereby revealing the true scope and nature of the opposition he faced. The silence was broken by David Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, the former CEO of a major competitor whom Marcus had recruited to the board 2 years earlier as part of an effort to strengthen the company's strategic capabilities. David's reputation for aggressive business tactics was well established, and Marcus had expected him to be either a powerful ally or a formidable opponent. The events of the morning were making clear which role he had chosen. Margaret raises an important point about governance, David said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling boardroom dynamics, but I think the more fundamental issue is whether Chen Industries needs a different kind of leadership as it transitions from a startup to a mature corporation. The entrepreneurial approach that built this company may not be the right approach for managing a $20 billion enterprise with global operations and thousands of employees. This was the heart of the challenge that Marcus had known would eventually come. David was articulating the argument that had destroyed countless founder CEOs throughout corporate history, that the very qualities that enable someone to build a company can become liabilities when that company reaches a certain scale and complexity. It was a sophisticated attack because it acknowledged Marcus's past successes while arguing for his future irrelevance. Marcus understood that his response to this challenge would determine not just the outcome of the current confrontation, but the future trajectory of everything he had built. The weak self that had been systematically eliminated over the past 2 decades would have responded with emotional appeals to his record of achievement, detailed explanations of his vision for the company's future, and defensive arguments about the value of his continued leadership. The strong self that Marcus had cultivated through years of disciplined self-transformation approached the challenge differently. Instead of defending his continued relevance, he would demonstrate it through the manner of his response. Instead of arguing for his authority, he would exercise it through strategic silence and precise action. Marcus reached for his leather journal and opened it to a page near the middle, removing a single sheet of paper that he placed on the table in front of him. The gesture was unhurried and deliberate, creating a moment of anticipation that focused the attention of everyone present on his next words. "David," Marcus said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had characterized all of his contributions to the discussion, "you're absolutely right that Chen Industries requires leadership appropriate to its current scale and complexity. The question is whether that leadership should be provided by someone who built this company from a single patent into a global enterprise, or by a committee of executives whose own companies were acquired by larger competitors when they failed to navigate similar transitions successfully." The response was devastatingly precise because it was delivered without malice or personal attack, but rather as a statement of objective fact that invited comparison between Marcus's track record and those of his critics. More importantly, it demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking and psychological insight that his opponents were arguing had become unnecessary in a mature corporation. The effect on the room was immediate and profound. 3 board members who had remained neutral thus far shifted in their chairs, and Marcus could see recognition dawning in their expressions as they realized that the argument for his replacement was being made by individuals whose own leadership had been less successful than his. But Marcus was not finished. The silence that followed his response to David served as preparation for what he understood would be the decisive moment of the confrontation. He had identified the true nature of the challenge he faced and the strategic vulnerabilities of his opposition. Now he would apply the principles of Machiavellian statecraft that had guided his transformation, striking not when his opponents expected it, but when they were psychologically unprepared for decisive action. "Robert," Marcus said, turning his attention to the board chairman who had initiated the meeting, "I appreciate your concern for proper governance, and I want to address it in a way that eliminates any ambiguity about the future direction of Chen Industries." Marcus stood and moved to the window, turning his back on the board members, a gesture that would have been impossibly risky for someone who was not completely confident in his position, but which demonstrated his understanding that true power often manifests through apparent vulnerability. When he turned back to face the room, his expression carried the calm certainty of someone who had moved beyond reaction into action. "I'm calling for a formal vote of confidence in my leadership," Marcus announced. "Not next month, not after further discussion, but today, in this meeting. Each of you will go on record as either supporting my continued leadership of this company or calling for my replacement. Those who vote for my replacement will have the opportunity to explain their vision for Chen Industries under different leadership. Those who support my continued tenure will be committing to the strategic direction I've outlined for the next 5 years." The proposal transformed the dynamics of the confrontation completely. Instead of defending against accusations and procedural challenges, Marcus had seized the initiative and forced his opponents to either commit to a direct challenge or abandon their campaign of indirect pressure. The move demonstrated the principle that Machiavelli had articulated centuries earlier, that decisive action often succeeds where defensive maneuvering fails. The silence that followed Marcus's proposal was different from all the previous pauses in the meeting. This was not the charged quiet of building tension, but rather the heavy silence of a group of people suddenly confronting the consequences of their actions. The comfortable ambiguity of expressing concerns and questioning procedures had been replaced by the stark clarity of a formal challenge that would have definitive winners and losers. Victoria Sterling was the first to break the silence, and her response revealed the psychological pressure that Marcus's strategic move had created. "Marcus, I don't think anyone came here expecting a vote of confidence. This feels like an ultimatum rather than a discussion about improving our governance processes." Her words revealed exactly what Marcus had suspected, that the challenge to his leadership had been conceived as a campaign of gradual pressure rather than a direct confrontation. His opponents had planned to use procedural complaints and governance concerns to steadily erode his authority over time, avoiding the risks associated with an open challenge to his position. By forcing an immediate, formal vote, Marcus had eliminated the possibility of this gradual approach and compelled his opponents to either commit to a direct challenge or abandon their campaign entirely. The strategy demonstrated his understanding that uncertainty and ambiguity often favor those who lack the psychological strength for direct confrontation, while clarity and decisiveness tend to expose the true balance of power in any situation. Marcus returned to his seat and once again opened his leather journal, this time to a page that contained detailed financial projections and strategic analyses. But he did not refer to the documents. Instead, he closed the journal and folded his hands, allowing another silence to develop as the board members grappled with the new reality he had created. "The vote will be by secret ballot," Marcus continued, his voice maintaining the same measured calm that had characterized his entire performance during the meeting. "Sarah will distribute paper and collect the votes. Each of you will write either confidence or no confidence and sign your name. The results will be announced immediately, and will proceed based on the outcome." This final detail, the requirement for signed votes rather than anonymous ballots, represented the culmination of Marcus's strategic approach to the confrontation. He understood that his opponent's confidence depended partly on their ability to avoid personal accountability for their challenge to his leadership. By requiring signatures, he eliminated their ability to vote against him while maintaining plausible deniability about their positions. The psychological pressure created by this requirement was enormous. Board members who might have been willing to vote against Marcus anonymously were forced to consider whether they were prepared to have their opposition to his leadership become a matter of public record within the company and the broader business community. As Sarah entered the room with the ballots, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 23 years earlier, when James Blackwood had orchestrated his professional destruction, Marcus would never have possessed the psychological composure necessary to navigate such a confrontation with strategic precision. The weak self that Blackwood had exploited would have become defensive, emotional, and ultimately self-destructive when faced with a direct challenge to his authority. The transformation that enabled Marcus to approach this confrontation with confidence had required not just the development of new skills, but the systematic elimination of the psychological vulnerabilities that made such challenges dangerous. The man who sat calmly watching his board members grapple with their ballot decisions had been forged through decades of disciplined self-examination and strategic thinking. But, perhaps most importantly, Marcus understood that the true victory in this confrontation would not be determined by the ballot count alone. Even if the vote went against him, his handling of the challenge had demonstrated qualities of leadership that would influence how he was perceived by investors, competitors, and potential allies throughout the business community. The man who could force his opponents into open confrontation while maintaining composure and strategic clarity was not someone who could be easily dismissed or marginalized, regardless of the immediate outcome. As the ballots were collected and Sarah began the count, Marcus allowed himself a moment of reflection on the broader implications of the principles he had applied throughout the confrontation. The strategic use of silence, the transformation of defensive positioning into offensive action, and the psychological pressure created by forcing opponents to commit to clear positions, these tactics had proven effective not because they were manipulative or deceptive, but because they reflected a deeper understanding of human nature and organizational dynamics. The weak self seeks to control outcomes through force, manipulation, or emotional appeal. The strong self influences outcomes through understanding, preparation, and the patient application of strategic pressure at precisely the right moments. The difference between these approaches is not merely tactical, it reflects fundamentally different ways of existing in the world and relating to conflict and challenge. When Sarah announced the results, 8 votes of confidence, 3 votes of no confidence, Marcus felt neither surprise nor triumph. The outcome had been determined not in the moment of voting, but through years of consistent performance, strategic relationship building, and the gradual demonstration that his leadership produced results that served the interests of everyone connected to Chen Industries. The 3 dissenting votes came from exactly the board members Marcus had expected: Margaret Fielding, David Chen, and Robert Hastings. Their opposition represented not just disagreement with his leadership style, but a fundamental philosophical difference about how power should be exercised and organizational decisions should be made. Marcus understood that these 3 individuals would likely resign from the board rather than continue serving under his leadership, and he had already prepared for that possibility. Their departure would actually strengthen his position by eliminating sources of internal opposition while sending a clear message to the broader business community about the consequences of challenging his authority unsuccessfully. But, as the meeting concluded and board members began filing out of the room, Marcus recognized that the most important victory had been achieved not through the ballot count but through the demonstration of principles that would continue to serve him long after this particular confrontation was forgotten. He had faced the ultimate test of his transformation, a direct challenge to everything he had built, and had emerged not just victorious, but strengthened. The weak self that had been systematically eliminated over the past 2 decades had faced its final temptation to reassert itself through reactive defensiveness and emotional response. The strong self that Marcus had cultivated had proven capable of transforming a moment of maximum vulnerability into an opportunity for decisive action and strategic advancement. As the boardroom emptied and Marcus remained alone with his thoughts, he understood that the true lesson of the afternoon lay not in any particular tactic or technique, but in the recognition that the man who has genuinely destroyed his weak self possesses a form of power that cannot be taken away through external pressure or opposition. This power derives not from position or title, but from the inner certainty that comes from knowing oneself completely and accepting responsibility for one's actions without reservation. The silence that filled the empty boardroom was not the absence of sound, but rather the presence of something far more profound, the quiet confidence of a man who had faced his deepest fears and emerged with his principles intact. In that silence lay the seed of everything that would follow, as Marcus prepared to apply the lessons of this confrontation to challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. 6 months after the boardroom confrontation that had redefined the power structure of Chen Industries, Marcus Aurelius Chen stood once again at the windows of his corner office, but the view had changed dramatically. The city below now included 3 new buildings bearing the Chen Industries logo, and the company's stock price had reached levels that made it one of the most valuable technology enterprises in the world. The prediction markets that tracked corporate performance had unanimously rated Chen Industries as the most likely candidate to dominate the emerging quantum computing sector for the next decade. But Marcus understood that the transformation represented by these external markers of success was merely the reflection of deeper changes that had occurred within the organizational culture and strategic positioning of his company. The principles that had enabled him to survive and triumph in the boardroom confrontation had been systematically applied throughout every level of Chen Industries, creating what business analysts were beginning to recognize as a new model of corporate leadership and organizational effectiveness. The leather journal that had accompanied Marcus through his transformation now contained not just personal reflections and strategic observations, but also detailed documentation of how the principles of strategic silence and systematic self-improvement could be scaled from individual practice to institutional implementation. The pages chronicled a remarkable experiment in applied psychology and organizational theory that had produced measurable results across every metric that mattered to stakeholders, employees, and competitors. 3 soft knocks on his office door interrupted Marcus's contemplation. The knocking pattern, 3 distinct sounds separated by precise intervals, was Sarah's way of indicating that she had information that required immediate attention but was not urgent enough to justify electronic communication. Over the 12 years of their professional relationship, she had developed an understanding of his communication preferences that enabled her to serve as more than just an administrative assistant. She had become an integral component of his strategic information network. "Come in, Sarah." Marcus turned from the window as she entered carrying a manila folder that he recognized as the format she used for sensitive intelligence reports. These documents contained information gathered through the extensive network of professional relationships, industry contacts, and strategic allies that Marcus had cultivated throughout his career. "The Yamamoto integration is proceeding ahead of schedule," Sarah reported, placing the folder on his desk with the particular care she reserved for documents containing confidential strategic intelligence. "Dr. Yamamoto's team has completed the quantum encryption protocols 3 months earlier than projected, and the preliminary testing indicates performance capabilities that exceed our most optimistic projections." Marcus nodded, acknowledging information that confirmed his decision to pursue the acquisition despite board opposition. The success of the Yamamoto integration had become a powerful validation of his approach to strategic risk-taking, but, more importantly, it demonstrated the competitive advantages that could be achieved by maintaining decision-making flexibility rather than subjecting every opportunity to committee analysis and debate. "There's something else," Sarah continued, her tone indicating that the more significant information was yet to come. "Our intelligence network indicates that Blackwood Industries is preparing a major competitive response to our quantum computing initiative. They've been quietly recruiting key personnel from 3 of our primary competitors, and financial analysis suggests they're preparing to announce a strategic partnership with European consortium that would position them as our primary rival in the quantum sector." The mention of Blackwood Industries caused Marcus to feel a complex mixture of emotions that he recognized and processed with the psychological awareness he had developed over decades of self-examination. James Blackwood, the man who had orchestrated his professional destruction 23 years earlier, had continued to build his corporate empire while Marcus was reconstructing himself and developing the philosophical foundation for his eventual return to competitive prominence. The irony was not lost on Marcus that his greatest early failure was now positioning himself as the primary threat to the success that had grown from the lessons learned through that failure. The situation represented a perfect test of whether the principles he had developed through study of Machiavellian strategy and systematic self-transformation could withstand the ultimate challenge, direct competition with the individual who had originally demonstrated their necessity. What's your assessment of Blackwood's strategic capabilities? Marcus asked, opening the manila folder to review the detailed intelligence that Sarah's network had compiled about their emerging competitors' plans and resources. Formidable but predictable, Sarah replied, demonstrating the analytical skills that had made her an invaluable strategic advisor despite her official role as an administrative assistant. Blackwood Industries has superior short-term financial resources and established relationships with major institutional clients, but their decision-making structure follows traditional corporate hierarchies that limit their ability to respond rapidly to market changes or technological developments. Marcus smiled slightly as he recognized the implicit contrast between Blackwood's organizational structure and the more flexible approach that he had developed at Chen Industries. The lessons learned from his original defeat had led him to create systems that prioritized strategic agility over bureaucratic stability, enabling rapid response to opportunities and threats while maintaining the accountability and oversight necessary for responsible management of a major corporation. Their weakness, Sarah continued, is the same weakness that enabled them to defeat you 23 years ago. They assume that superior resources and established advantages will always overcome superior strategy and execution. They're preparing to compete with the Chen Industries they think they understand, not the organization you've actually built. This observation revealed one of the most important strategic advantages that Marcus had developed through his transformation, the ability to be systematically underestimated by competitors who based their assessments on outdated information and incomplete understanding. The public perception of Chen Industries still reflected its origins as a technology startup led by an innovative but relatively inexperienced entrepreneur. This perception had become increasingly inaccurate as Marcus applied the lessons of his strategic education to building organizational capabilities that most competitors did not recognize or understand. The approaching competition with Blackwood Industries represented an opportunity to demonstrate these capabilities while also providing closure to the relationship that had initiated Marcus's journey toward strategic sophistication. But Marcus understood that the true significance of this competition lay not in any personal vindication it might provide, but rather in its potential to validate the broader principles that had guided his transformation. Schedule a strategic planning session for next week, Marcus instructed, beginning to formulate the approach that would govern Chen Industries' response to Blackwood's challenge. I want detailed analyses of their personnel, technological capabilities, financial structure, and decision-making processes. But I also want psychological profiles of their key leadership, particularly Blackwood himself. Understanding their strategic capabilities matters, but understanding their psychological limitations may be more important. Sarah nodded and made notes in her electronic device, but Marcus could see in her expression that she was anticipating additional instructions that would reflect the more sophisticated approach to competitive strategy that he had developed over the past 2 decades. The most important element, Marcus continued, will be our response timeline. Blackwood Industries will expect us to react immediately and directly to their competitive initiative. They'll be prepared for a traditional corporate war involving public relations campaigns, aggressive pricing strategies, and attempts to recruit their key personnel. Instead, we'll respond with strategic silence. The concept of applying strategic silence to corporate competition represented the culmination of everything Marcus had learned about the relationship between timing, psychology, and competitive advantage. Just as individual psychological pressure could be created and directed through the careful use of silence in interpersonal interactions, competitive pressure could be applied to rival organizations through strategic non-response that forced them to operate without clear intelligence about their opponent's intentions and capabilities. How long? Sarah asked, understanding immediately that Marcus was planning to allow Blackwood Industries to implement their competitive strategy without immediate response from Chen Industries. 6 months, Marcus replied, a timeline that he knew would seem impossibly long to most corporate strategists but which reflected his understanding that true competitive advantage often emerged through patient execution of long-term plans rather than reactive response to competitor initiatives. We'll use that time to accelerate our quantum computing development, strengthen our market position with existing clients, and observe how Blackwood Industries reveals their strategic approach through their attempts to compete with an opponent who refuses to engage on their chosen terms. The strategy represented a direct application of the lessons Marcus had learned from his study of Machiavelli's insights about the relationship between patience and power. The prince who could resist the impulse toward immediate action while maintaining strategic focus on long-term objectives possessed enormous advantages over rivals who were psychologically compelled to seek rapid results and immediate gratification. But Marcus also understood that the success of this approach would depend on the organizational discipline and cultural coherence that he had spent years developing within Chen Industries. Strategic silence in the face of competitive pressure required not just leadership conviction, but also the confidence and understanding of employees, investors, and stakeholders who might interpret non-response as weakness rather than strength. We'll need to prepare internal communications that explain the strategic rationale without revealing our specific intentions, Marcus continued, anticipating the challenges that would arise as Blackwood Industries' competitive initiative became public knowledge. Our employees need to understand that we're choosing not to respond immediately because we have confidence in our long-term position, not because we're uncertain about how to respond. This aspect of the strategy reflected Marcus's recognition that organizational psychology operated according to principles similar to those that governed individual behavior. Just as personal confidence could be undermined by reactive defensiveness, corporate confidence could be eroded if employees interpreted strategic patience as leadership uncertainty or competitive weakness. Over the following weeks, as Blackwood Industries launched their quantum computing initiative with the fanfare and media attention that Marcus had expected, Chen Industries maintained complete public silence about their competitive response. The contrast between Blackwood's aggressive publicity campaign and Chen Industries' apparent non-response generated significant commentary from industry analysts and business journalists, most of whom interpreted the situation according to conventional assumptions about corporate competition. Marcus followed this commentary with interest but without concern, recognizing that the initial confusion and speculation about Chen Industries' lack of response was serving his strategic purposes perfectly. Blackwood Industries was implementing their competitive strategy without clear intelligence about how their primary rival intended to respond, forcing them to make assumptions and strategic commitments based on incomplete information. More importantly, the public nature of Blackwood's initiative was providing Chen Industries with detailed intelligence about their competitors' capabilities, strategic approach, and psychological state. Every press release, every public presentation, every recruitment announcement was revealing information that Marcus could use to refine his understanding of how Blackwood Industries operated and where their vulnerabilities might lie. 3 months into the period of strategic silence, Marcus received a communication that confirmed his assessment of the psychological pressure that his non-response was creating within Blackwood Industries. The message came through intermediaries, but its origin and intent were unmistakable. James Blackwood was requesting a private meeting to discuss potential collaboration opportunities between their two companies. The request represented exactly the kind of psychological breakthrough that Marcus had anticipated. Blackwood Industries had launched their competitive initiative expecting immediate response and direct confrontation. The absence of such response had created uncertainty and psychological pressure that was now manifesting as an attempt to gain intelligence through direct contact. Marcus recognized the meeting request as both an opportunity and a potential trap. Agreeing to meet with Blackwood would provide valuable intelligence about his competitor's strategic state and psychological condition, but it would also end the period of strategic silence and potentially reveal information about Chen Industries' intentions and capabilities. The decision required the application of principles that went to the heart of everything Marcus had learned about strategic thinking and self-mastery. The weak self would have been tempted to use the meeting as an opportunity for personal vindication, demonstrating how completely he had transformed himself since their last encounter 23 years earlier. The strong self recognized that such motivations were psychologically gratifying but strategically counterproductive. After 2 days of consideration, Marcus declined the meeting request through a brief message that provided no explanation for his refusal and no indication of when or whether he might be willing to reconsider. The response was deliberately designed to increase rather than resolve the psychological pressure that his strategic silence was creating within Blackwood Industries. The effects of this decision became apparent within weeks, as industry intelligence indicated that Blackwood Industries was accelerating their competitive timeline and making strategic commitments that suggested increasing urgency and decreasing patience. The absence of clear intelligence about Chen Industries' response was forcing them to operate according to assumptions and projections rather than concrete information about their competitors' capabilities and intentions. Marcus understood that this dynamic represented one of the most powerful applications of strategic silence in competitive situations, the ability to force opponents to reveal their own strategies and limitations while maintaining complete flexibility about how and when to respond. Blackwood Industries was essentially conducting their competitive campaign against an opponent who remained invisible, requiring them to make strategic commitments without understanding what they were competing against. As the 6-month period of strategic silence approached its conclusion, Marcus began preparing the response that would demonstrate the competitive advantages that Chen Industries had developed during their apparent inactivity. The quantum computing technologies that had been refined and accelerated during this period represented capabilities that exceeded anything Blackwood Industries had announced or demonstrated, but the technological advantage was only one element of the comprehensive competitive strategy that Marcus had developed. The true innovation lay in the integration of technological capability with strategic psychology and organizational discipline. Chen Industries would not simply announce superior quantum computing technologies, they would demonstrate these capabilities through partnership agreements, client implementations, and market positioning that revealed the futility of Blackwood Industries' competitive approach while establishing Chen Industries as the dominant force in quantum computing applications. The announcement, when it came, was delivered not through press releases or media presentations, but through concrete business results that spoke more eloquently than any marketing campaign could. Chen Industries revealed partnerships with 3 major financial institutions that would implement quantum encryption protocols across their global operations, licensing agreements with 2 national governments for quantum communication systems, and research collaborations with 5 leading universities that would accelerate quantum computing development across multiple applications. Each of these announcements demonstrated not just technological superiority, but also the strategic relationships and organizational capabilities that Chen Industries had been developing while Blackwood Industries focused on public competition and market positioning. The contrast between surface-level competitive tactics and deep strategic preparation was stark and unmistakable. The response from Blackwood Industries was immediate and revealing. A series of increasingly desperate attempts to match Chen Industries' announcements through partnerships that were obviously reactive and competitive commitments that demonstrated the psychological pressure they had been experiencing throughout the 6-month period of strategic silence. Marcus observed these developments with the satisfaction that came not from personal vindication, but from the validation of principles that had required decades to develop and implement. The man who had been destroyed by James Blackwood 23 years earlier had been reactive, defensive, and psychologically vulnerable to manipulation. The organization that now dominated quantum computing markets had been built through the systematic application of opposite qualities, strategic patience, psychological discipline, and the understanding that true competitive advantage emerges through preparation and timing rather than force and speed. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this competitive triumph was its demonstration of how individual transformation could be scaled to organizational implementation. The principles that had enabled Marcus to reconstruct himself after his original failure had been systematically applied to create institutional capabilities that reflected the same understanding of psychology, strategy, and timing. As Marcus prepared to address the shareholders' meeting that would mark the conclusion of the most successful year in Chen Industries' history, he reflected on the relationship between personal transformation and professional achievement that had defined his career. The weak self that had made him vulnerable to Blackwood's original manipulation had been replaced not just by greater individual capability, but by the wisdom to create organizational structures and cultural practices that embodied the lessons learned through decades of strategic education. The silence that had enabled his personal transformation had become an institutional weapon that could be deployed against any competitor who operated according to conventional assumptions about corporate conflict and strategic response. The man who had learned to destroy his weak self had created an organization that was similarly invulnerable to the psychological and strategic pressures that typically determined competitive outcomes. standing before the shareholders who had entrusted him with their investments and the employees who had committed their careers to his leadership, Marcus understood that the true measure of his transformation was not the destruction of his weak self, but the creation of institutional capabilities that would continue to generate competitive advantage long after his individual involvement had ended. The legacy of strategic silence and systematic self-improvement was not personal achievement, but rather the demonstration that individuals and organizations could be fundamentally reconstructed through the patient application of psychological insight and strategic discipline. The man who had once been destroyed by his own weaknesses had become proof that such weaknesses were not permanent characteristics but rather temporary limitations that could be systematically overcome through understanding and effort. In the applause that followed his presentation of Chen Industries' achievements, Marcus heard not just recognition of financial and technological success, but acknowledgement of something more profound, the validation of principles that suggested new possibilities for how individuals and organizations could approach the fundamental challenges of competition, conflict, and strategic development. The journey that had begun with personal failure and systematic self-examination had culminated in institutional success and the demonstration that the lessons of strategic psychology and self-mastery could be applied at any scale. The weak self that had been destroyed through decades of disciplined transformation had been replaced not just by individual strength, but by organizational capabilities that represented a new model for how power could be developed, maintained, and deployed. As the meeting concluded and Marcus returned to his office, the silence that awaited him was not empty space but rather the presence of unlimited possibility. The man who had learned to weaponize silence and destroy his weak self had become the architect of institutional invincibility, demonstrating that the principles discovered through individual transformation could be scaled to create organizational and competitive advantages that redefine entire industries. The most dangerous weapon, as Machiavelli had understood centuries earlier, was not superior force or better information, but rather the discipline to remain silent while others revealed their weaknesses and the wisdom to act only when action could produce decisive results. Marcus had become the living embodiment of these principles, and Chen Industries had become their institutional expression. In that silence lay not an ending, but rather the foundation for everything that would follow, new challenges that would test these principles, new applications that would extend their reach, and new demonstrations that the man who destroys his weak self truly cannot be destroyed by others, precisely because he has eliminated the psychological vulnerabilities that external pressure typically exploits. The transformation was complete, but the possibilities it had created were infinite.